Can we start by talking about the news in which Trump announced that he has spoken to Vladimir Putin and they've talked about exchanging visits? I want to read you a little bit of Trump's own readout and how he posted it. He said, "We've also agreed to have our respective teams start negotiations immediately, and we'll begin by calling President Zelensky of Ukraine to inform him of the conversation, something which I'll be doing right now. I've asked Secretary of State Marco Rubio, Director of the CIA John Ratcliffe, National Security Advisor Michael Waltz, and Ambassador Special Envoy Steve Witkoff to lead the negotiations, which I feel will be successful." Right. So he is the first American president to engage with Putin since the invasion. I just want to know your views of all of this, including the fact that he spoke to Putin first and not his ally Zelensky about this.
Well, two signals from that, Christiane. One is that the phase in which Vladimir Putin was a pariah from the American perspective, that seems to be over. And the potentially, emphasize word potentially good news, is it obviously allows negotiations over Ukraine. It allows the nuclear arms control negotiations to resume because the current agreements expire in less than a year, and so forth. So there's no shortage of things to talk about. The sequencing and the way it was packaged, as though the two big leaders spoke and next we'll get to Vladimir Zelensky, is unfortunate because it does raise the specter of a deal being crafted over his head, reinforced a little bit by the comments of the new Secretary of Defense, who is essentially saying what already are the American parameters, and to some extent, though we can talk about it, to some, but not totally at variance with Ukraine's preferences.
Well, let's talk about, because a lot of them are at variance. I mean, for instance, Zelensky has been given a lot of interviews, and his latest is that he said, he would be willing to give up certain territory. But of course, he was talking about Kursk, which, as we know, they took precisely for negotiating process. Anyway, the Russians, the Kremlin has completely, dismissed that. And from all the past that we've heard from Putin and the Kremlin, literally zero of Zelensky's proposals are acceptable. Do you think that Putin has shown any difference in terms of wanting the total surrender of Ukraine?
Actually, I don't think he's asking for and he's not getting the total surrender of Ukraine. I also think it's really essential for people watching this to distinguish between a ceasefire and a peace treaty. And as I understand it, we're more likely talking about a ceasefire. So even if Ukraine signs on to a deal that essentially reflects the current battlefield, it doesn't mean they give up their long-term claims any more, by the way, than Vladimir Putin would be asked to give up his fever dream of totally reintegrating Ukraine into a greater Russia. I think we're talking about a ceasefire in place. I think the Secretary of Defense is more right than not in saying that it is fanciful to think that Ukraine can regain that territory through military means. A ceasefire would end the suffering. It would allow Ukraine to be rebuilt. What's really essential, I'd say, though, are two things. One is whether we get an American commitment, an open-ended commitment to provide Ukraine with arms. And second of all, whether the Europeans are not only willing to provide some arms, but willing to provide some forces on the ground. If you're not going to get a NATO commitment, the United States doesn't want that for any number of reasons, then could you get a European commitment, or at least a coalition of the willing, Poland and maybe a few other countries, possibly the UK and France, willing to provide, if you will, the substance of a security commitment.
So what did you hear from Hegseth? I think he said security guarantees for Ukraine, but he obviously dismissed, completely took off the table any thought about Ukraine joining NATO. But in terms of boots on the ground, he didn't commit to Americans being in peacekeeping roles at all.
No, I think there's a division of labor here. Boots on the ground would not be NATO, would be selective European countries willing and able to do it. And again, the big question is, and I hope this is forthcoming, that the United States would sign on to providing arms for an open-ended period, essentially as long as they were necessary. If that's the outcome, not perfect, but not bad. And I think the whole idea of a permanent peace treaty, that's the sort of thing that I think actually would have to wait till after Vladimir Putin passes from the scene. And we'll have to wait for the day when you have a Russian leader who's interested in reintegrating Russia with Europe and the West. One other thing that didn't, at least I hear today, I did not hear it today, Christiane, is what would happen with sanctions. to what extent would President Trump be prepared at this stage, if you get a ceasefire, to relax certain economic sanctions? To what extent would he hold some in reserve for that second phase negotiation of a permanent peace?